Hi, welcome again to our study in the book of Daniel about a man of integrity, faith, and prophetic insight. This is session 14 of our study of the book of Daniel. In this session, we're covering chapters 11, verses 2 through 35, which focuses primarily on the rise of a Seleucid ruler known as Antiochus IV Epiphanes. We'll begin with an overview of the book of Daniel. As we've seen before, it opens in 605 BC when Daniel and a number of young men are taken captive following a siege of the city by the Babylonian king Nebuchadnezzar. And then chapters 2 through 6 are the experiences of Daniel in the courts of Babylon. Beginning in chapter 7, we have the first of four visions that are given to the person of Daniel. In chapter 7, the first vision is his vision of the four beasts. In chapter 8, Daniel's vision of the ram and the goat. The third vision is in chapter 9, Daniel's vision of the 70 weeks prophecy. And then chapters 10, 11 through 12 comprise the fourth vision, which is Daniel's final vision. It's trouble for Israel near and far. These are set in chronological order, beginning in 553 BC and running to about 536 BC, as far as when Daniel had these visions. Now, back in chapter 2, we learned that history will culminate with the kingdom of God, and in chapter 7, that this kingdom will be given to the Messiah. What we're then observed throughout these four visions is we have increasing revelation about the persecutions, especially from Antiochus IV and the Antichrist of the future, which must precede Messiah and his kingdom. Right now, I want to take some time to look at Daniel 11, 2 through 45 in relationship to the 70 weeks prophecy. As we saw in our study of chapter 9, the 70 weeks prophecy begins with the decree in the time of Artaxerxes, as recorded in Nehemiah 2, about 444 BC. And then we have the first 69 weeks are divided into two parts. The first 7 weeks, or 49 years, is the period when Jerusalem is being rebuilt. And then there's another 69 weeks until we have Messiah coming in AD 33. During that interval, we see the rise of several world kingdoms. Medo-Persia followed Babylon, then Greece, the Hellenistic empires, and then finally Rome. Now, after the 69th week, there's a couple of important things take place. Messiah is said to be cut off. Of course, that refers to the crucifixion of our Lord Jesus Christ. And then in AD 70, the Romans destroy Jerusalem. The 70th week is suspended to the future because that will be the time when the Antichrist arises on the world scene. During the interim period between the cross and the time when Antichrist is manifest, our Lord Jesus Christ will be building his church. But at some point in the future, the Antichrist will come into play and he will enforce a covenant with Israel. I take this to mean that he's a false Messiah who will try to enforce the Mosaic law code on the nation, which, of course, the Jews in unbelief would be expecting. Now, in the middle of that final week, it says that he breaks the covenant, and so that period is divided into two sections, each being 3.5 years. The latter part is what we call the Great Tribulation, and that will conclude with Messiah's second coming. He puts a stop to the atrocities of the Antichrist, and the Antichrist is slain. This will be followed by the kingdom of Messiah Jesus on earth, according to Revelation 20, and in accordance with many other passages of the Bible. Now, if we back up to the time of the Hellenistic empires, in particular the Seleucid Empire, we have the rise of Antiochus IV Epiphanes, and his purpose is to serve as a type of the Antichrist. So by studying his character and activities, we get a pretty good idea of what Antichrist will be like. Now, how does Daniel chapter 11 fit in with all of this? Well, chapter 11, verses 2 through 20 concern the period beginning in 539 BC and leading up to Antiochus IV Epiphanes. Then verses 21 through 35 concern his reign, which was during the years 175 to 164 BC. Later in the future, Daniel 11:36 through 45 will refer directly to the Antichrist. Now, during this 70th week is the time when there'll be God's humbling of Israel. And this is what God will use to humble Israel and bring her to accept Messiah Jesus. So she's going to suffer during this period, but there's a good purpose or intent behind it all. Now, to analyze this final vision of Daniel, which is chapters 10 through 12, we call it troubles for Israel, both near and far. In chapter 10:1 through 11:1, Daniel is prepared to receive the vision. We covered that in session 13. Then in this session, we have the rise of Antiochus IV Epiphanes, who is a type of Antichrist. He ruled 175 to 164 BC, so that's the present session 14. Now next we will discuss the reign of the wicked Antichrist in session 15, and then our final session, which will be section 16, will look at the final outcome for Daniel's people. Once again now, session 14 is going to focus upon the rise of Antiochus IV Epiphanes, a type of the Antichrist. Now, verses 2 through 4 of chapter 11 give us the background to the Ptolemaic Seleucid conflict. And we begin reading, "And now I will tell you the truth. Behold, 3 more kings are going to arise in Persia." Well, he means after Cyrus the Great. So we had, first of all, his son Cambyses, who ruled 530 to 522. This was followed by a short rule of one called Smerdis, also known as Bardia, in 522 BC. And thirdly, Darius I, also known as Darius the Great, who ruled 522 to 486 BC. Now, this Darius should not be confused with Darius the Mede. Those are 2 different individuals. Verse 2 goes on to say, "Then a 4th will gain far more riches than all of them. As soon as he becomes strong through his riches, he will arouse the whole empire against the realm of Greece." The 4th person here is Xerxes I, who reigned 485 to 465 BC. We know him in the Bible as King Ahasuerus of the book of Esther. And the great banquet feast that we read about in Esther chapter 1 is really his making preparations for an invasion of Greece. So it says here that he'll arouse the whole empire against the realm of Greece. This was Xerxes' assault on the empire of Greece. At that time, Athens was destroyed in 480 BC. Now, even though his assault was not entirely successful, it left a very bitter taste in the people of Greece and helps us understand why Alexander the Great was so intent on conquering the Persian Empire. Verse 3, "And a mighty king will arise, and he will rule with great authority and do as he pleases." Well, that is a direct reference to Alexander the Great. In 330 BC, he conquered the empire of Persia, only to die in 323 BC at the age of 32. Verse 4 goes on to say, "But as soon as he has arisen, his kingdom will be broken up and parceled out toward the 4 points of the compass, though not to his own descendants, nor according to the authority which he wielded, for his sovereignty will be uprooted and given to others besides them." Well, to the 4 points of the compass refers to the 4 Hellenistic rulers that divvied up Alexander's the kingdom upon his death. And we've mentioned them before: Lysimachus, Cassander, Seleucus, and Ptolemy. Now, as we look at a map of the ancient Middle East, we can see the division of Alexander's empire. Over in the kind of the lower left quadrant, we have Egypt. That will be the Ptolemaic kingdom. And then to the north of that, through most of what we know as Syria and Iraq and so forth is the Seleucid kingdom. And caught in between is what we call Colais Syria. And this is an area that comprised what we would know today as Lower Syria, Lebanon, and the land of Judah. So what's going to be discussed now in a lot of this chapter is the fighting that goes on between the Ptolemaic kingdom, that will be the kings of the south, and the northern kingdom, the Seleucid kingdom, that'll be called the kingdom of the north. And they're always going to be vying for who has control of Colais Syria, which includes the land of Judah. So Daniel chapter 11, 5 through 20, traces the battles between these two kingdoms for control of Colais Syria. Then Daniel 11, 21 through 35, documents the persecution of the Jews under the evil Seleucid king Antiochus IV Epiphanes. So throughout this chapter, there's going to be reference to a number of these Ptolemaic and Seleucid rulers. Once Alexander the Great died, there was conflict as to who would assume his kingdom, and it ended up being divvied up into 4 parts. And the Ptolemies, or the name comes from the first ruler, Ptolemy I Soter, who began his rule in 323. The Seleucid Empire begins with one called Seleucus I Nicator, and about 312 BC. And we can see all their descendants, and in the column on the right, you see at the bottom Antiochus IV Epiphanes. So he's the last of the Seleucid rulers that's referred to in this chapter. So the Ptolemies, again, will be the kings of the south. The Seleucids will be the kings of the north. Now we look more directly at verses 5 to the first part of 6a. We see the beginning of the conflict between these two great kingdoms. And I'm reading now from the NIV version, which says in verse 5 that the king of the south will become strong. So that's a reference to Ptolemy I Soter, who began to rule in 323 BC until 282 BC. It goes on to say, but one of his commanders will become even stronger than he and will rule his own kingdom with great power. And that's Seleucus I Soter, who reigned from 301 to 281 BC. Initially, Seleucus was subservient to Ptolemy, but then there was, gradually a conflict between them, and he went on to try to initiate his own rule. Verse 6, after some years, they will become allies. So there's a number of wars that goes on between them that we call the Syrian Wars. In 253 BC, after the first Syrian War, which was 274 to 271 BC, and the second Syrian War, dated 260 to 253 BC. So after some years, they will become allies. But then we go on to read in verse 6, the daughter of the king of the south will go to the king of the north to make an alliance, but she will not retain her power, and his power will not last. So in 253 BC, Bernice, the daughter of Ptolemy II Philadelphus, is given in marriage to Antiochus II of Syria. So it's a political marriage intending to try to bridge the gap between them and put an end to the animosities. But this isn't really going to solve things. Now, I could go on trying to explain a lot of the details that are given in this chapter, and we simply just don't have time. And the problem is that most of us from the West don't have the historical knowledge to understand the details of this. So I developed a paper with detailed notes of Daniel chapter 11, verses 2 through 21. And these are available for downloading from my website, which is listed here. In this paper, it has 2 columns, which you can see in the lower half of the paper. In the column on the left, I give the actual biblical text, and when it mentions a person, though it doesn't indicate their name, I have put their name in blue so you'll know who it's referring to. Whereas the column on the right, I give lots of historical details as to what this all concerned and what was going on. So this is available for you if you really want to dig in and understand all the minute details of the chapter. Now we want to just give you a little bit of an overview of the history leading to Antiochus IV, because that's where we're headed with all of this. So if we could map it out, it would look something like this. In verses 2 through 4, we have the rise of the Ptolemaic and Seleucid kings following Alexander the Great. In verses 5 through 9, the origin of the conflict between the Ptolemies and Seleucids for control of the eastern Mediterranean. In verses 10 through 20, it focuses on a ruler called Antiochus III and the Seleucid victory for control of the eastern Mediterranean. Now, Seleucus III rules 222 to 187 BC. And then a large section here, verses 21 through 35, looks at Antiochus IV's Epiphanes' reign of terror and persecution of the Jews. And again, the dates for his rule are 175 to 164 BC. All right, can't go all through all the details, but I want to pull out a few things here from verses 14 through 16. It says in verse 14, in those times, many will rise against the king of the south. Well, in 200 BC, there was a massive victory for Antiochus III and the Seleucids at the Battle of Panium. It says, those who are violent among your people will rebel in fulfillment of the vision, but without success. In other words, some of the Jews joined in helping him because they resented the rule of the Egyptians that they had often suffered under. Verse 15, then the king of the north will come and build up siege ramps and will capture a fortified city. So following that victory at the Battle of Panium, Antiochus III went on to capture Sidon, where the Egyptians had retreated to, forcing them to surrender. The latter part of verse 15 says the forces of the south will be powerless to resist, that is, the Egyptians. Even their best troops will not have the strength to stand. So the Egyptians under Ptolemy V were no longer able to contend against the Seleucid kingdom. Verse 16, the invader will do as he pleases. No one will be able to stand against him. He will establish himself in the beautiful land and will have the power to destroy it. Now, significantly, the land of Judah came under the firm control of the Seleucid kings as a result of what we read here in these previous verses, and especially the Battle of Panium. Well, the reason I point this out is because this sets the stage for Antiochus IV Epiphanes' persecution of the Jews and the rise of the Maccabees to oppose him. Now that the Seleucids are in firm control of the land of Judah, they're going to seek to impose their will upon that land. Now we move on to verse 20, and we see a transition from Antiochus III to his son Seleucus IV. Verse 20 says, his successor, that is the successor of Antiochus III, that is a reference to Seleucus IV, the son of Antiochus III, who reigned 187 to 175 BC. Now here's a picture of a coin from that period showing this very king, Seleucus IV. You see his image on one side of the coin on the left, and on the other side his name, as well as a particular god that's associated with his rule. Now, the thing about Seleucus IV is during the reign of Antiochus III, he had some conflicts with the kingdom of Rome, which was moving eastward in that time. And as a result of that, he faced enormous financial challenges due to these military conflicts with Rome, and thus had to resort to heavy taxation. In other words, the Seleucids suffered defeat and had to retreat from some lands they had occupied, and Rome imposed a lot of tribute upon them. Well, that put them in financial difficulty. So it goes on to say in verse 20, he will send out a tax collector to maintain the royal splendor. Well, about 178 BC, Seleucus sent an official named Heliodorus throughout the kingdom to collect taxes, and that was also included taxation on Jerusalem. The final part of verse 20, in a few years, however, he will be destroyed, that is, Seleucus IV will be destroyed, yet not in anger or in battle. Well, we know that from history. In 175 BC, Seleucus IV was assassinated by Heliodorus. So he didn't die in battle. He was assassinated. And this brings us to our primary character, Antiochus IV Epiphanes. So this section of verses 21 through 35, I want to give you a quick overview of the reign of Antiochus IV that we see here. In verses 21 through 24, we see Antiochus's rise in power as an illegitimate Seleucid ruler. In verses 25 through 28, Antiochus's rivalry with Egypt. In verses 29 through 31, Antiochus's persecution of the Jews after the Second Egyptian campaign. So Antiochus is going to have two major campaigns against Egypt, and one of these is followed by his persecution of the Jews. And finally, verse 32 through 35, the Jewish uprising against Antiochus, which we know today as the Maccabean Revolt. So we'll begin by looking now at Antiochus's rise in power, as we see it described in verses 21 through 24. It says, in his place, that would be in the place of Seleucus IV and his assassin Heliodorus, a despicable person will arise on whom the honor of kingship has not been conferred. But he will come in a time of tranquility and seize the kingdom by intrigue. Well, this is a reference to Antiochus IV. Although he was a son of Antiochus III, the true heir to the throne was Seleucus's son, who we know as Demetrius I Soter. But Antiochus was able to get in there and through intrigue seized it for himself. Verses 22 through 23, the overflowing forces will be flooded away before him and shattered, and also the prince of the covenant. After an alliance is made with him, he will practice deception, and he will go up and gain power with a small force of people. Well, these verses probably have in view the turmoil in the Seleucid Empire at the time that Antiochus IV seized the throne. Now, there's reference in the midst of this to the Prince of the Covenant. We are not completely sure what this refers to or who it refers to, but typically the word covenant is used elsewhere in Daniel to refer to the biblical covenant of the Jews. So some have suggested that this might be a reference to the high priest Onias III. He was actually murdered with the knowledge of Antiochus IV Epiphanes, and an illegitimate high priest in the land of Judah was put in his place. Now, verse 24 says, in a time of tranquility, he will enter the richest parts of the realm, and he will accomplish what his fathers never did, nor his ancestors. He will distribute plunder, booty, and possessions among them, and he will devise his schemes against strongholds, but only for a time. So Antiochus IV sought to win over the allegiance of others to his rule by bribery, thereby solidifying his grip of power on the Seleucid kingdom. Now, verses 25 through 28, we see his rivalry with Egypt. Verse 25 says he will stir up his strength and courage against the king of the south, that would be Egypt, against Egypt, with a large army. So the king of the south of Egypt will mobilize an extremely large and mighty army for war, but he will not stand, for schemes will be devised against him. So they're mobilizing for war. Well, the war that this refers to took place in December of 170 BC, and it's called the Battle of Pelusium. So here on the map that you see, of mark where Pelusium is, it was on the eastern border of Egypt, and it was a way of protecting the kingdom of Egypt from attacks from the east. And so what we see here is that Antiochus IV had a major victory over the Egyptians at Pelusium. And as a result of that, enabled him or allowed him to invade Egypt in 169 BC. And verse 26 says that with reference to now the king of the south, that is Egypt, those who eat his choice food, that is the Egyptian king's choice food, will destroy him, or they'll be intent to crush him. And his army will overflow, but many will fall down slain, that is, they'll be slain in battle. Well, the true ruler of Egypt at this time was Ptolemy VI. His rule, however, was complicated by the fact that he was still young, and regents of the young king appointed his siblings as co-rulers. So that's why it says those who eat his choice food, that is, they sit at the same table with him, they'll intend to crush him. Now, verse 27 goes on to say, as for both kings, their hearts will be intent on evil, and they will speak lies to each other at the same table, but it will not succeed, for the end is still to come at the appointed time. The reference to both kings, that would be Antiochus IV Epiphanes, the Seleucid ruler, king of the north, and Ptolemy VI, the Egyptian ruler, the king of the south. Actually, they were related to one another in some way, but they're going to be not going to trust each other, and they're going to be deceptive. So they formed some sort of an agreement, but in reality, they were really just out to deceive each other. And finally, verse 28, then he, that is Antiochus IV, will return to his land with much plunder, but his heart will be set against the holy covenant, and he will take action in the return to his own land. Notice that his heart will be set against the holy covenant. So in 169 BC, Antiochus made his return to Syria, and as he did so, he had to pass through the land of Judah, and passing through Jerusalem, he plundered the Jewish temple. Obviously, he's in need of financial resources. Now we get some idea about how things were going at this time through what's recorded for us in the book of Maccabees. In 1 Maccabees, chapter 1, verse 20 through 24, we read about Antiochus's return trip to Syria. After subduing Egypt, Antiochus returned in the 143rd year. For us, that would be 169 BC. He went up against Israel and came to Jerusalem with a strong force. He arrogantly entered the sanctuary and took the golden altar, the lampstand for the light, and all its utensils. He took also the table for the presence of the bread of the presence, the cups for drink offerings, the bowls, the golden censers, the curtain, the crowns, and the gold decoration on the front of the temple. He stripped it all off. He took the silver and the gold and the costly vessels. He took also the hidden treasures that he found. Taking them all, he went into his own land. Well, obviously, that didn't go over real well with the Jews that were seeking to be faithful to the Lord and who had great honor, or they honored, the temple where worship took place. Now, in verses 29 through 31, we read about Antiochus's persecution of the Jews. Verse 29, at the appointed time, he will return and come into the south, but this last time it will not turn out the way it did before. Okay, now we're at Antiochus's second Egyptian invasion, which we believe to have occurred about the spring of 168 BC. So he's going to take his forces, and he's going to proceed southward again and try to invade Egypt and control what's going on there. But verse 30 says, for ships of Kittim will come against him. Now the word Kittim really means the coastlands, but it was a way of referring in Jewish literature to the Romans. So this looks at Roman naval forces that were now protecting Egypt. Previously, Rome had been very engaged with some fighting different things to the west, but they had become victorious, and now they're in position to come to the aid of Egypt. And so these Roman ships come to Egypt, and they're being in support of Egypt. Now, one thing we know from history, from historians of that period, is that there was a Roman consul named Gaius Popilius Linus who swiftly confronted Antiochus when he had come to Egypt, handing him a letter, a senatus consultum, from the Roman Senate ordering him not to fight and instead to withdraw from Egypt. Now, there's a funny story that kind of goes along with this, that when Antiochus IV was confronted by this Roman consul and was given this order not to fight, instead withdraw, that he said, well, I want time to be able to think about this before I give my response. At that point, Gaius Popilius Linus took a stick or some other pointed object. He drew a circle around Antiochus IV, and he said, fine, take your time to consider it, but let me know your answer before you step outside the circle. In other words, he wasn't going to give him any more time. Verse 30 goes on to say, therefore he, that is Antiochus IV, will be disheartened and will return and become enraged at the Holy Covenant and take action. So he will come back and show no regard for those who forsake the Holy Covenant. He's enraged at the Holy Covenant. So Antiochus is not in a good mood, and he took out his anger on the biblical faith at Jerusalem as he made his retreat to Syria, where his capital was. So at this time, the city walls of Jerusalem were torn down, thousands of Jews were slaughtered, and many were sold into slavery. The latter part of verse 30 says, so he will come back and show regard for those who forsake the Holy Covenant. So Antiochus IV wanted to impose a Hellenization upon the land of Judah. Those who were faithful to the Lord, of course, resisted. But there were a number of Jewish people who were unfaithful, and they went along with the Hellenization deal. And so when he says he'll show regard for those who forsake the Holy Covenant, he's referring to these unfaithful Jews of the land. So this will be the unfaithful Jews who adopted corrupt Hellenistic practices. Verse 31 says, forces from him will arise, desecrate the sanctuary fortress, and do away with the regular sacrifice. That would be the sacrifice each morning and evening. That was part of the commandments of the Lord. And finally, they will set up the abomination of desolation. Now, according to 1 Maccabees, this was a pagan altar erected on top of the Jewish temple altar. That brings us to verses 32 through 35, which will be our conclusion. We have the Jewish uprising against Antiochus. Verse 32 says, by smooth words he will turn to godlessness those who act wickedly toward the covenant. In other words, Antiochus IV is going to have a great evil influence upon those of the land of Judah. Antiochus' smooth words will cause many Jews to forsake the Lord. But the people who know their God will display strength and take action. So faithful Jews who will oppose Antiochus. And this brings on what we call the Maccabean revolt that went on from 167 to 160 BC. Now, Antiochus will actually die about 164 BC, but the Maccabean revolt will continue against the Seleucids for a few years after his death. One thing we have today, of course, are books that we call 1st and 2nd Maccabees, and in one of these there's an account of a man called Mattathias, who was a priest and father of Judas Maccabeus. And I will be reading here from 1 Maccabees chapter 2, verse 22 through 28. He was centered in a city to the northwest of Jerusalem called Modin. And there a Seleucid force had come and was trying to get people to sacrifice to a pagan altar. And he said, we will not obey the king's words by turning aside from our religion to the right hand or to the left. Now when he had finished speaking these words, a Jew came forward in the sight of all to offer sacrifice on the altar in Modin, according to the king's command. In other words, this was an unfaithful Jew. When Mattathias saw it, he burned with zeal and his heart was stirred. He gave vent to righteous anger. He ran and killed him on the altar, that is, killed a fellow Jew, but an unfaithful one. At the same time, he killed the king's officer, that is, Antiochus's officer, who was forcing them to sacrifice. And he tore down the altar. Thus he burned with zeal for the law, just as Phinehas did against Zimri, son of Salu. Well, this is going to kick off what's called the Maccabean revolt. Verse 33, those who have insight among the people will give understanding to the many, yet they will fall by sword and by flame, by captivity and by plunder for many days. Well, those who have insight is those who could build up and encourage others from the Word of God. And so as this uprising takes place, they're going to gain strength and intend to encourage other people by reminding them of the Scriptures. But yet, many of them will be killed in the process. Now it says, when they fall, verse 34, they will be granted a little help, and many will join with them in hypocrisy. So some were motivated by a true zeal for the Lord, but there were some Jews who opposed the Seleucids, but not because of spiritual motives. They just wanted to throw off, those who were ruling over them. Verse 35, some of those who have insight will fall, that is, they're going to be killed, in order to refine, purge, and make them pure until the end time, because it is still to come at the appointed time. So many Jews will die in the process, but their greatest trials are still to come. They will be victorious in being successful against the Seleucids and achieve their independence by the year 160 BC. But yet, it's not going to be the end of things. The true end is still to come at the appointed time, and that will be with the Antichrist. Now, we've kind of just briefly covered verses 2 through 35, and there's a lot of historical detail there. It's very important because it helps us understand why Antiochus IV came to rule and how he became this great persecutor of the Jews, and he is a type of the Antichrist to come. So in summary, following Alexander the Great's defeat of the Persian Empire, the division of his kingdom resulted in many years of warfare between the Ptolemies of Egypt and the Seleucids to the north of Judah. From this eventually emerged the evil persecutor Antiochus IV Epiphanes, spawning the Maccabean revolt in 167 BC. So, the main purpose in this chapter is to outline how Antiochus IV came to rule and what he did once he did so. By studying this, we have it gives us an idea of what to expect with the future Antichrist, and that will be the subject of our next session. Before we leave, though, we consider a lesson for us today, particularly about facing persecution. Daniel 11, verse 32 says, by smooth words that he, that is Antiochus IV, will turn to godlessness those who act wickedly toward the covenant. But the people who know their God will display strength. That is, they're going to stand firm, not give in to that, and they will take action. There's a principle we can learn from that. In times of persecution and moral godlessness, faithful disciples, those who know and love their God, will remain true to the Lord and earnestly working to defend and promote his kingdom. Now, that's something we could apply to our lives today. We see an increasing assault against moral righteousness and against everything that the Lord would desire for our nation and for the world. And at times it seems like we're losing the battle. But the main thing is that we remain faithful and true to the Lord, and we go on earnestly working for the promotion of the kingdom of God and the glory of our Lord Jesus Christ. Okay, Finally, a peek ahead of Daniel 11:36 to 45, which will be our subject for the next session. In Daniel 11:21 through 35, we saw the evil Seleucid ruler Antiochus IV Epiphanes, but he's a type of the Antichrist of the end time that will be discussed in verses 36 through 45. So, from type to the ultimate satanic opponent of God. That will be our subject of our next session. Well, that concludes our study of session 14 and Daniel chapter 11, verses 2 through 35. We hope to see you again back at session 15. And until then, we wish you God's richest blessings and His grace on your life.